What we believe protects us from pain often becomes the very thing that prevents us from ever becoming whole. And by the time we realize this, the architecture of our soul has already been rewritten. There exists within the human psyche a natural drive toward wholeness, toward the integration of all aspects of the self into a unified conscious being. This process, which unfolds across the entire lifespan, requires something essential: the capacity to face oneself honestly, to encounter the shadow without flinching, to hold the tension between opposites without collapsing into one side or the other. Cannabis use, particularly when sustained over years, systematically dismantles the very psychological structures that make this individuation possible. The damage is subtle at first, barely perceptible, but over time it creates a psychic landscape so altered that the person can no longer recognize how far they've drifted from their authentic nature. Consider what happens to consciousness itself under the regular influence of cannabis. Consciousness is not a static thing, but a dynamic process, a constant dialogue between the ego and the unconscious, between the known and the unknown aspects of ourselves. This dialogue requires a certain quality of attention, a capacity to remain present with whatever arises internally without immediately reaching for escape or alteration. The person who uses cannabis regularly is training their psyche in the opposite direction. They're teaching consciousness that whenever discomfort arises, whenever difficult material begins to surface, the response is to chemically alter awareness rather than to turn toward and integrate what's emerging. This pattern creates what might be understood as a fundamental rupture in the relationship between the ego and the self. The ego, that center of conscious awareness and will, begins to lose trust in its own capacity to handle what the psyche presents. It becomes dependent on external intervention, unable to believe it can navigate internal terrain without chemical assistance. The self, that totality of the psyche that includes both conscious and unconscious elements, begins to withdraw its guidance. Why would the unconscious continue to offer up material for integration when the conscious mind has repeatedly demonstrated that it will refuse the offering, choosing instead to blur and numb rather than to see and feel? The relationship with the shadow undergoes particularly profound distortion under sustained cannabis use. The shadow contains all those aspects of ourselves that we've deemed unacceptable and relegated to the unconscious. Rage, jealousy, selfishness, cruelty, desire, need, all the parts that don't fit our conscious self-image get pushed into darkness. The work of maturation requires gradually bringing these shadow elements into consciousness, not to act them out, but to acknowledge them as part of our totality, to integrate them so they no longer possess us from the unconscious. Cannabis creates an illusion of shadow work. Under its influence, users often feel they're accessing deeper parts of themselves, confronting hidden material, achieving insights about their darker nature. They have experiences of expanded awareness where they seem to see themselves more completely. But this is not genuine integration. It's a temporary lifting of repression without the ego strength to actually metabolize what's revealed. The shadow material surfaces, is briefly glimpsed, and then is either pushed back down when sobriety returns or remains unintegrated, floating in a kind of psychological limbo where it's been seen but not truly owned. Over years of this pattern, the shadow doesn't get smaller or more integrated. It grows denser and more autonomous. All the material that's been repeatedly glimpsed but never genuinely worked with accumulates. The person develops what might be called a marijuana-mediated shadow, a version of their darker aspects that only appears when chemically altered, that feels disconnected from their sober identity, that remains split off rather than integrated. They become, in effect, two people, the sober persona and the high persona, with the shadow material bouncing between these two states, but never actually being claimed by a unified self. The destruction of dream life represents one of the most devastating injuries to the psyche that cannabis inflicts. Dreams are not random neural firing or meaningless garbage. They are the primary means through which the unconscious communicates with consciousness, offering compensatory images and narratives that balance one-sided conscious attitudes, warning of dangers the conscious mind refuses to see, pointing toward potentials the ego has overlooked. When someone loses their dreams to chronic cannabis use, they lose this guidance system. The unconscious continues to try to communicate, but the messages never reach consciousness. The person navigates life without the internal compass that dreams provide. The consequences of this extend far beyond just missing interesting dreams. Without dreams, the person loses access to the symbolic function of the psyche. Symbols are how the unconscious expresses truths that cannot be captured in literal language, how it points toward meanings that exceed rational comprehension. When the symbolic function atrophies from years of REM suppression, consciousness becomes increasingly literal, increasingly unable to grasp the deeper meanings and patterns that organize experience. The person thinks more concretely, less metaphorically. They become trapped in the surface of things, unable to perceive the deeper currents that move beneath obvious reality. Consider what happens to the complex structures within the psyche under sustained cannabis use. A complex is an emotionally charged cluster of associations organized around a core wound or theme. We all have them. The mother complex, the father complex, the inferiority complex. These are not pathologies but normal psychological structures that shape how we interpret and respond to experience. The work of consciousness is not to eliminate complexes, but to become aware of them, to see how they color perception and drive behavior, to develop enough ego strength to not be wholly possessed by them. Cannabis interferes with this awareness in a particularly insidious way. When a complex is activated, it floods consciousness with emotion and associated thoughts. The person feels overwhelmed, cannot think clearly, is driven by forces they don't understand. Cannabis temporarily mutes this activation, creating distance from the complex's grip. The user experiences this as relief, as finally being free from the tyranny of their patterns. But they're not free. They're simply dissociated from the complex, which continues to operate in the unconscious, growing stronger precisely because it's not being consciously engaged. Over time, the cannabis user develops increasingly rigid defenses against complex activation. They structure their entire life to avoid triggers, and when avoidance fails, they immediately medicate. The complexes remain completely unconscious, entirely autonomous, running the person's life from the shadows, while the conscious mind remains oblivious to their influence. The person believes they're in control, making free choices, when actually they're being driven by forces they refuse to face. The cannabis hasn't freed them from their complexes. It's ensured those complexes remain completely unconscious and therefore completely powerful. The capacity for holding tension, what might be called the psychological container function, deteriorates progressively in the regular cannabis user. Life constantly presents us with paradoxes and contradictions that cannot be resolved through logic or force. We must hold the tension between conflicting desires, between competing truths, between irreconcilable aspects of reality. This holding is not passive. It's an active psychological function that requires developed consciousness, the ability to contain conflict without premature resolution, to sit with ambiguity without collapsing into certainty. Cannabis systematically destroys this capacity. Its essential effect is to relieve tension, to blur contradictions, to make everything feel more unified and harmonious. The user learns to reach for this artificial resolution rather than developing the internal capacity to hold tension creatively. When faced with psychological conflict, instead of allowing the tension to generate a third thing, a creative synthesis that transcends the original opposition, they short-circuit the process with chemical intervention. The psyche never develops the muscularity that comes from holding and working with tension. It remains weak, unable to tolerate ambiguity, constantly seeking premature closure or escape. This failure to develop tension-holding capacity has profound consequences for psychological growth. All genuine development occurs through the clash of opposites, through confronting aspects of ourselves or reality that contradict our current understanding. If we can hold this tension long enough without fleeing into distraction or forced resolution, something new emerges. A more complex, more nuanced understanding develops. We mature through the integration of contradiction. The cannabis user, having systematically avoided this tension-holding work for years, remains psychologically immature regardless of their chronological age. They have the personality structure of someone much younger because they've prevented the very process through which maturation occurs. The persona, that mask we wear to meet the world's expectations, undergoes particular distortion in chronic cannabis users. A healthy persona is flexible, allowing us to adapt to different social contexts while remaining connected to our authentic self beneath the mask. But it's also not the totality of who we are. We need to be able to take the persona off when appropriate, to let our guard down, to reveal our genuine nature in intimate contexts. Cannabis use creates a peculiar relationship with the persona where the boundaries become confused. Many users report that cannabis helps them drop their personas, allows them to be more authentic, more genuine, more themselves. There's some truth to this initially. The loosening effect of the substance can temporarily relax the rigid social masks people wear, but over time something different develops. The persona doesn't become more flexible. Instead, the user develops a cannabis persona, a particular identity they inhabit when high that becomes just as rigid and false as any other mask. They believe they're more authentic when high, but actually they've just exchanged one persona for another, neither of which is the genuine self. The more insidious development is that the authentic self, the person beneath all masks, never gets properly developed because the user is always either wearing their sober persona or their high persona. They're never simply themselves, present and undefended. The work of individuation requires developing enough security in one's own being to sometimes exist without any persona at all, to risk showing up completely as oneself. The chronic cannabis user never does this work. They remain always mediated, always behind some version of a mask, never risking the vulnerability of undefended, authentic presence. Consider the damage to what might be called psychological metabolization. When we have experiences, particularly difficult or intense ones, the psyche needs to process and integrate them. This is not automatic. It requires us to reflect on what happened, to feel the emotions it generated, to understand what it means for our self-concept and worldview, to allow it to change us appropriately. This metabolization often happens through a combination of conscious reflection and unconscious processing, through dreams, through journaling, through conversation, through simply sitting with experience until it's fully digested. Cannabis short-circuits this metabolization process. Difficult experiences happen, but before the psyche can properly process them, the person gets high. The experience gets coated in a chemical buffer that prevents full feeling and integration. Over years of this pattern, the person accumulates a backlog of unmetabolized experience. Things have happened to them that they've never fully processed, that sit in the psyche like undigested food in the stomach, generating psychological symptoms, but never fully integrated into the narrative of self. This backlog creates what might be understood as a kind of psychological constipation. The person feels stuck, heavy, burdened by something they cannot quite name. They're carrying years of unprocessed material, and the weight of it makes forward movement difficult. But they cannot process this material while continuing to use cannabis, because the substance is what's preventing metabolization in the first place. They're trapped in a cycle where the very thing they're using to feel better is what's making genuine wellness impossible. The relationship between the conscious and unconscious minds, that crucial dialogue that drives psychological development, becomes increasingly dysfunctional under sustained cannabis use. In healthy psychological functioning, the unconscious is constantly sending information to consciousness through symptoms, slips of tongue, emotional reactions, dreams, bodily sensations, and intuitions. Consciousness, in turn, needs to attend to these messages, to try to understand what the unconscious is communicating. This back and forth is how we learn about ourselves, how hidden aspects of the psyche make themselves known, how growth occurs. Cannabis introduces static into this communication system. The messages from the unconscious still come, but they're received in a distorted state. The user misinterprets what the unconscious is trying to say, or they receive the message while high, and it seems profound, but then dissolves when sobriety returns. Or they understand the message, but lack the willpower to act on it, because cannabis has weakened the executive functions of consciousness. Over time, the unconscious essentially gives up trying to communicate. Why send messages that will be ignored or misunderstood? The dialogue stops, and the person is cut off from their own depths. This rupture in internal communication leaves the person dependent entirely on conscious will and rational thought, which are insufficient for navigating the complexity of human existence. They lose access to instinct, to intuition, to the wisdom of the body, to the guidance of the self. They're trying to live from the ego alone, and the ego, without connection to the greater psyche, is like a general who's lost contact with all other forces. making decisions in isolation that are inevitably inadequate to the situation's actual complexity. The damage to the capacity for genuine solitude is particularly significant. Solitude is not the same as loneliness. Solitude is the ability to be alone without distraction, to sit with oneself in silence, to be present with one's own consciousness without needing entertainment or escape. This capacity is essential for psychological development because it's only in solitude that we can truly hear ourselves, can allow unconscious material to surface, can encounter who we actually are beneath all the noise and distraction of life. Cannabis users become increasingly incapable of genuine solitude. Being alone without being high becomes intolerable. They cannot sit with themselves in stillness because immediately all the material they've been avoiding surges up. Anxiety, restlessness, uncomfortable thoughts and feelings, all the things that cannabis has been suppressing, these flood consciousness the moment there's no distraction. So they either get high or they find some other distraction, but they never develop the capacity to simply be with themselves. This means they never develop real self-knowledge, because self-knowledge requires the ability to observe oneself quietly and honestly, which requires being able to tolerate one's own unmediated presence. The inflation of ego that paradoxically accompanies cannabis use, despite the substance's apparent ego-dissolving effects, represents another form of psychic damage. Many users believe cannabis makes them more humble, more connected to something larger than themselves, less ego-driven. But what actually develops over time is a subtle form of inflation, where the person begins to believe they have access to special wisdom or consciousness that others lack. They've had profound experiences while high, they've glimpsed what they interpret as universal truths, and they begin to identify with these experiences in a way that separates them from others and from ordinary reality. This inflation is particularly dangerous because it masquerades as spiritual humility. The person genuinely believes they've transcended ego, that they're more evolved or conscious than those who haven't had similar experiences. But this is just ego in a different costume. True humility comes from recognizing our limitations, our darkness, our ordinariness. The inflated cannabis user cannot see their own shadow, cannot acknowledge their own dysfunction because they've identified with the positive experiences the drug provided and split off everything else. They become insufferable in their pseudo-spirituality, convinced they're enlightened, when actually they're more defended against genuine self-knowledge than ever. The loss of what might be called psychological courage is perhaps the most tragic damage cannabis inflicts. Life requires courage, not the physical courage of facing external danger, but the psychological courage of facing internal truth. The courage to see ourselves honestly, including the parts we'd rather deny. The courage to feel difficult emotions fully rather than numbing or escaping. The courage to change what needs changing, even when change is frightening. The courage to pursue our authentic path, even when it means disappointing others or facing uncertainty. Cannabis systematically erodes this courage. Every time the user chooses to get high rather than face something difficult, they're teaching themselves that they cannot handle difficulty without chemical assistance. They're reinforcing the belief that they're weak, that reality is too overwhelming, that they need external help to cope. Over years of this pattern, the original courage that every human possesses, the native strength of the psyche, atrophies like an unused muscle. The person becomes genuinely unable to face what they once could have faced, genuinely incapable of tolerating what they once could have tolerated, not because the challenges have grown, but because their capacity has shrunk. This loss of courage extends to the courage required for individuation itself, for the journey toward wholeness and authenticity. Becoming who you truly are requires repeatedly choosing the difficult authentic path over the easy, inauthentic one. It requires disappointing people whose approval you crave. It requires giving up identities that have become comfortable, even if false. It requires facing the terrifying freedom of having to create your own meaning in an absurd universe. The cannabis user, having lost their psychological courage, cannot undertake this journey. They remain stuck in whatever identity and life circumstances feel safe and familiar, never risking the transformation that individuation demands. The destruction of future orientation creates a temporal prison for the chronic user. Human consciousness has the unique capacity to extend itself into past and future, to learn from history and plan for what's coming. This temporal consciousness is what allows for meaningful goal pursuit, delayed gratification, and the construction of a life narrative that extends beyond the present moment. Cannabis progressively destroys this future orientation. The altered state is characterized by absorption in the present moment, by a kind of timelessness that feels pleasant and even profound during the experience. But chronic use of a substance that repeatedly collapses consciousness into the present moment has the effect of destroying the psyche's capacity to orient toward the future. The person loses the ability to imagine their future self clearly, to feel connected to that future self, to make choices now that serve that future person. They become trapped in an eternal present where only immediate gratification matters, because the future feels abstract, unreal, disconnected from the self they currently experience. This makes any long-term project impossible, any delayed gratification irrational, any sacrifice for future benefits senseless. The person is locked in the now, but it's not the enlightened now of mindful presence. It's the collapsed now of someone who's lost the future dimension of consciousness. The damage to the symbolic imagination represents another profound loss. The psyche thinks not just in words and logic, but in symbols, in images that carry multiple layers of meaning simultaneously. Dreams speak in symbols. Art communicates through symbols. The great myths and religions of humanity operate symbolically. The ability to think symbolically, to grasp that something can simultaneously be itself and represent something beyond itself, this is a higher function of consciousness that separates humans from simpler forms of awareness. Cannabis users often believe they're accessing enhanced symbolic consciousness while high, seeing deeper meanings in everything, making profound connections between disparate things. And initially, the substance can sometimes facilitate loose associations that feel creatively fruitful, but chronic use ultimately damages symbolic function. The person begins to make connections that aren't actually meaningful, to see significance where there is none, to confuse intoxicated rambling with genuine insight. More devastatingly, they lose the ability to engage with symbols soberly. Poetry stops moving them. Myth feels like mere story. Art becomes decorative rather than transformative. The symbolic dimension of existence closes, leaving them trapped in a literal, one-dimensional world. Consider what happens to the relationship with suffering under sustained cannabis use. Suffering is not something to be eliminated, but something to be understood, to be moved through, to be allowed to transform us. The psyche uses suffering as a signal that something needs attention, that change is necessary, that we're misaligned with our authentic path. Different types of suffering mean different things, and learning to read the messages in our suffering is part of psychological maturation. Anxiety tells us we're avoiding something. Depression tells us we're disconnected from authentic living. Anger tells us boundaries have been violated. Grief tells us we've lost something significant. Cannabis teaches a fundamentally different relationship with suffering. Suffering is the enemy to be eliminated through chemical means. Pain is not information, but malfunction. Discomfort is not a teacher, but an intolerable state to be exited as quickly as possible. Over years of this approach, the person loses the capacity to learn from suffering. They cannot read its messages because they're constantly muting the signal. They don't grow through difficulty because they're always escaping difficulty. The suffering that could have been transformative becomes simply something to avoid, and in avoiding it, they avoid the very growth it was pointing toward. This flight from suffering creates what might be called a superficial psyche, a consciousness that skims along the surface of experience, never going deep enough to be genuinely affected by anything. The person goes through life, but life doesn't go through them. They remain unchanged by experiences that should change them, unaffected by encounters that should affect them, untransformed by suffering that should transform them. They accumulate years without accumulating wisdom, because wisdom comes from metabolized suffering, and they've been refusing to metabolize anything for decades. The fragmentation of the personality structure under chronic cannabis use creates what might be understood as a false unity. The psyche is not naturally unified. We contain multitudes, different aspects of ourselves that often conflict, different drives and desires that pull in opposite directions. The work of individuation is not to eliminate this multiplicity, but to create a relationship between the parts, to have a center of consciousness that can relate to the various elements without being possessed by any of them. This is genuine integration, unity that respects and includes diversity. Cannabis creates a different experience altogether. It produces a temporary feeling of unity, a sense that all the parts are harmonized, that inner conflict has dissolved. The user feels whole in a way they rarely do sober. But this is not genuine integration. It's a chemical blurring of boundaries that makes everything feel the same. The conflicts haven't been resolved through conscious work. They've been temporarily anesthetized. When sobriety returns, the fragmentation returns, often feeling worse by contrast with the artificial unity of the high state. The person becomes dependent on the drug for any sense of internal coherence, and the actual work of integration never happens. Over years of this false unity experience, the person loses the ability to distinguish between real integration and chemically induced harmony. They believe they're whole when high, that they've achieved what years of therapy or meditation or spiritual practice aim for. They don't see that they've simply drugged themselves into a simulated experience of wholeness, while the underlying fragmentation grows worse from neglect. The actual multiplicity of the psyche, which needs to be consciously related to and integrated, remains entirely unaddressed, and the false unity provided by cannabis becomes increasingly necessary to mask the growing internal chaos. The deterioration of will represents one of the most essential damages cannabis inflicts on the psyche. Will is not the same as willpower or force. It's the capacity of consciousness to intend, to choose, to initiate action from a centered place rather than merely reacting to circumstances or impulses. Will is what allows us to say no to immediate gratification in service of larger purposes, to persist through difficulty toward meaningful goals, to shape our lives according to our values rather than just being shaped by external forces. Cannabis progressively weakens the will. The person finds it increasingly difficult to initiate action, particularly action that requires sustained effort or that conflicts with immediate comfort. They know what they should do, they can see clearly what needs to happen, but they cannot summon the volitional energy to do it. They remain passive, watching their life unfold as if they were spectators rather than authors. Plans are made but not executed. Resolutions are formed but not kept. Dreams are entertained but not pursued. The person becomes increasingly helpless, increasingly at the mercy of circumstance and habit, increasingly unable to exercise meaningful agency in their own life. This weakening of will extends to the will to become conscious itself. There is, in the psyche, a drive toward greater consciousness, toward knowing oneself more fully, toward bringing unconscious material into the light of awareness. But this drive can be overridden, and cannabis users systematically override it. Every time they choose to get high rather than to turn toward what's difficult and see it clearly, they're exercising will in service of remaining unconscious. Over time, the will to consciousness atrophies entirely, and the person becomes invested in not knowing, in not seeing, in remaining in the comfortable fog of partial awareness. They've reversed the fundamental trajectory of psychological development, using will to resist consciousness rather than to pursue it. The final and perhaps most comprehensive damage is to the process of individuation itself. Individuation is the central concept, the understanding that the purpose of the second half of life is to become who you actually are rather than who you were taught to be, to integrate all aspects of yourself into conscious wholeness, to find and fulfill your unique purpose. This is not narcissistic self-improvement. It's a difficult, often painful process of facing everything you've avoided, integrating everything you've rejected, and allowing the self to guide you toward your authentic nature and calling. Cannabis use, particularly when sustained over the years when individuation should be occurring, completely derails this process. The person remains stuck in the first half of life, oriented toward external achievement and social adaptation, never making the turn inward that would allow genuine development, or they make the turn inward but in a false way, believing that drug experiences constitute inner work, when actually they're just escaping into altered states that require no real confrontation with self. The entire architecture of consciousness that individuation requires, the capacity to face difficulty, to integrate the shadow, to hold tension, to metabolize experience, to maintain dialogue with the unconscious, to exercise will in service of growth, all of this is systematically dismantled by chronic cannabis use. The tragedy is that many cannabis users are precisely the people who most need individuation, who have the sensitivity and depth to undertake the journey, who are called toward it by an inner restlessness and hunger for authentic meaning. But instead of answering that call, they reach for a substance that provides a simulated experience of what they're seeking. They have profound experiences while high that feel like they're accessing deeper reality, achieving expanded consciousness, becoming more whole. And these experiences are real in their way, but they're occurring in a chemically altered state that cannot be sustained, and that requires no genuine psychological development. The person mistakes these experiences for the destination when they should be recognizing them as glimpses that point toward work that must be done soberly, slowly, with full consciousness. The user remains forever on the threshold, having seen through the doorway but never actually walking through it, never undertaking the genuine journey of transformation that the glimpse was meant to inspire. They spend years, decades, having the same insights while high, feeling the same temporary wholeness, experiencing the same fleeting transcendence, never realizing that they're trapped in a loop, that they're not actually going anywhere, that the substance that showed them the doorway is the very thing preventing them from walking through it. And slowly, imperceptibly, all the psychological capacities they would need for the real journey erode, until even if they wanted to begin the genuine work of individuation, they've lost the tools necessary to undertake it. The damage is complete, and the life that might have been, the person they might have become, remains forever potential, never actualized, sacrificed to the false promise of chemical transcendence.